Thanks
So,
so much.
so I'll do the whole introduction now. But for those who don't know, this is the Taranisha Lunchbox series. We do this once a month, and it's an opportunity for us to engage with our community and also hear what our community is doing. And it's growing in leaps and bounds. I quite like these sessions. And it's opportunities for students to present their work, for our associates to present their work, anyone who's doing research within the center or with the center. It gives them an opportunity to really talk about things. And today we have Mr. Mboya with us. And I was reading his bio last night and this morning again, and I was trying to figure out how to shorten it, if at all possible. But he's a highly accomplished individual, and Mr. Mboya is a governance consultant with a broad range of experience in the field, specifically in anti-corruption, parliamentary democracy, public policy, research, and advocacy. And he's worked with governments, parliaments, and civil society at various international organizations. He's a national of Kenya, and he's educated at tertiary levels in both the US, the UK, and South Africa. And he's dedicated himself to the pursuit of accountability for people of all walks of life. Specifically, Thomas worked in organizations such as UN Habitat, the African Parliamentarians Network Against Corruption, the State University of New York Parliamentary Support Program, the African Center for Open Governance, the Inter-Parliamentary Union, the British High Commission, and the list goes on and on. But the research that he's really looking into today, and I got a chance to take a sneak peek at one of the papers, is really trying to understand what the nature of public participation looks like on the African continent from a digital perspective. And as he says in his abstract, he really looks at, traditionally we view politicians addressing the masses at a political rally and trying to galvanize support. But in the age of social media, what does that mean now? And how does online engagement and online forms of public participation actually impact legislation and service delivery? So I'm very, very excited for this presentation today. And very, very happy to see those who also joined us online. So I'll leave it to Mr. Mboya to give us his presentation for about 30 minutes or so, and thereafter we'll do a series of questions and answers. So Mr. Mboya, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon, everyone. I won't do anything more in terms of an introduction because I think I've already been introduced, and my apologies for the rather long and rambling introduction that I sent through. Would you like me to share a presentation, or should I just speak to the points? I'm flexible either way. Hello? Hello?
The room seems to have frozen. Maybe.
Yeah.
Yes.
Here they come back.
Yeah, so we just got disconnected on our side. But if you're happy to share your presentation, please do.
Okay. Just a moment.
Perfect.
Do let me know when you can see my screen.
We can see your screen. It's currently on, I think, the last slide.
Interestingly, I can't see it.
When I unshare and then reshare, and it should just fix itself.
Okay, let me stop sharing. Right, let me try and share again. It's trying to get me to update a driver, which I don't want to do right now. Okay, let me try this one more time.
Yep, we can see it again. Can you see your own screen, hopefully?
Nope, I cannot. So maybe if you don't, I think it's probably that driver that requires updating. Apologies for that. So maybe if I just speak to it, is that all right?
Yeah, so I think it's fine if you just speak to it.
Okay, hold on. Let me just stop sharing so that.
You know the slide. In a bit later, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks again for the opportunity to be able to get together and have a little bit of a discussion around the paper that I have written, which is entitled Politicians on Digital Platforms, a Resource or a Threat. Essentially, what I was trying to look at is the relationship between politicians and the electorate as a result of digital platforms and social media. We do know about the rise in the popularity of social media. And so essentially, I'm looking at the effect that this has had on the relationship between politicians and the electorate. By way of background, the Digital 2022 Global Overview Report tells us that about 58.4% of the total global population, which amounts to about 4.6 billion people, are social media users. So, essentially, consider a little bit more than half of the total global population are social media users. When we look a little bit closer to home, where we are on the African continent, in East Africa, 10% of the population are social media users. This compares to 45% in Southern Africa, 16% of the population in West Africa, and 56% of the population in North Africa all are social media users. Looking at Kenya, where I am, 20% of the population are active social media users, which is actually double the East African average. So you can see that the population here in Kenya are growing in terms of their social media usage. And looking at data gathered from January 2020 to January 2021, we see that here in Kenya, the country experienced a 25% growth in active social media users. So year on year, there is actually still significant growth that's taking place in terms of the number of people who are actively using social media. And with the proliferation of mobile phone usage as well, coupled with the nature of our politics, it's inevitable that digital platforms are going to play a very, very important role in the democratic process, in how people engage in the democratic process, and also in the nature of politics. But that's something we'll come to in a moment. In terms of the problem, what is the problem that I was looking at in this paper? And it begins really from taking a look at the historical context of politics, not just in Kenya, but also around the African continent, such that the political discourse has often historically been a one-sided affair. What do I mean by that? It's a situation where politicians are essentially speaking to the electorate within the context of, for example, a political rally. So the point there is that it's a one-way communication rather than a two-way discourse. Now, I know that, for example, in Kenya here we have what we call barazas, which are much smaller meetings where a politician might get together with a certain number of constituents to discuss a particular issue. But by and large, the political discourse is held within the context of political rallies. And the only drawback there, of course, is that it is only that one-way communication. The second historical context piece is that in many African cultures, including here in Kenya, political elites and politicians can often be seen as demigods by the electorate. So what they say and what they do has a tremendous amount of sway and a tremendous amount of weight with the electorate. So given that we are now in a digital age, one of the things which I will talk about quite often this afternoon is the effects of misinformation and disinformation. And so when you have an electorate that, revere the political class to some extent, then you have an increased challenge with regards to misinformation and disinformation. The Statista 2022 report indicates that 82% of those surveyed said that they used social media as a news source. So a significant number of people using social media to be able to obtain their news. Globally, the same survey indicates that showed an increasing number of social media users that expressed the fact that they don't trust social media as a source of news. So you have that the disparity there, where there's a significant amount of people using it using social media as a news source, but also a significant number of people who don't actually trust social media as a source of news. And when you look at African elections, at the time of writing this paper, sometime last year, I looked at, there were 10 African elections that were held between 2017 and 2018 as an example. And in 10 of those African elections, bots were found to be increasingly prevalent in attempting to sway public opinion. So when you add all that together, you've got a context in which politicians are seen as demigods. You've got a digital space that is rife with misinformation and disinformation, and a significant number of users who essentially mistrust what they are seeing coming from social media in terms of their news. So this is part of the problem that I was looking at in this paper. So in terms of, with regard to politicians on digital platforms, so can we see them then as a resource or a threat? And if we base it on the assumption that social media provides a platform for politicians to be able to engage with the electorate, some of the questions that I sought to answer were as follows. First and foremost, as a result of digital platforms, to what extent are politicians more or less accessible in reality? Secondly, if in fact they are more accessible, has that increased accessibility translated to improved policy, legislation, service delivery, or accountability? And thirdly, what role really has misinformation or disinformation played in relations between politicians and the electorate, and specifically what can be done to protect the electorate from these risks. The methodology I used in carrying out my research was a qualitative research methodology. I did carry out an extensive literature review, and then also conducted semi-structured interviews with a number of politicians, but not just politicians, also governance and public policy experts, political scientists, as well as members of civil society. So I was able to draw some views and feedback from a fairly wide cross-section of stakeholders. And so that the data analysis that I then carried out was from the information gathered from those various interviewees. Social media is essentially the modern day public sphere. This is where people come to discuss, not just issues of the day, social issues of the day, the politics of the day, as well as, issues taking place, in day-to-day life. However, a majority of social media users, in terms of how they use social media, demonstrated in a previous survey that people on social media tend to act in ways that are at odds with their typical demeanor, meaning that on social media, they may behave in ways that are atypical, ways that they wouldn't ordinarily behave in. This is for a number of reasons. On social media, people tend to be, it's found that people tend to be bolder. They may be more or less sincere. They may use the fact of being on social media to be even more provocative. And the reality, again, of social media is that many of the interactions that people undertake, they do so anonymously. And so you can see that, in such cases, it's quite easy to see how one might, be more comfortable in being provocative because of this sense of anonymity. So the point there is that with regards to politics and social media, if it is an environment in which people are acting and communicating and engaging in a manner that is not entirely consistent with how they would do typically, then of course this in some way affects how they engage with politicians and the kind of inferences and information that we can derive as a result. With regards to social media and politics, both candidates and voters have a choice of platforms for dialogue, and in terms of the platforms of choice, and there are a number of them which we shall talk about in a moment. So therefore, this union that we have between social media and politics has proven that you put politics into social media, it can be divisive. We've seen that a number of times, and it can be polarizing, especially if not carefully moderated. And my mind immediately goes back to the ban on Donald Trump, and essentially then him going off and starting a new social media network. So what does that tell us? I mean, it does tell us the importance that he as a politician attached to being on social media. I think we all know that certainly he was a divisive and polarizing figure, But the point is that it was incredibly important for him to be able to reach particular demographics, his supporters, using social media. And so that ban on social media on Twitter, on Facebook, was something that he absolutely could not contemplate, and so therefore had to go out and start another social media network. I think it's called Truth Social, and sadly I haven't had the good fortune of engaging on that particular platform, so I can't tell you much about it. But certainly it was necessary for him, or he thought it was necessary for him to do so. Looking very quickly at the situation here in Kenya, where I am, the political discourse, as I mentioned before, has traditionally been sort of that one-way affair, where it's a communication from the political elite to their constituents within a political rally type of format. That's a one-way discussion. So really what digital platforms and social media have done is to provide the potential for a two-way discussion. And that's really a huge game changer, because it does provide the opportunity for very robust debates, for public policy debates, and essentially I think the priority there is that the electorate are able to provide their own views, their own experiences, their own realities to politicians for the purposes of their legislative work. When you look at the technological advances, we have the proliferation of the mobile phone, and here in Kenya we see that has been a huge game changer as well, putting mobile phones and now even smartphones in the hands of a significant number of the population. And when you add that to what we see in terms of the exponential growth of social media users, then what that translates to is more opportunity for political debate. And this is very, very welcome, because this it creates an environment where the electorate, for one, are able to hold their politicians to account. Politicians will have come to office having made some commitments, some promises. So at least to some extent, by way of social media, the electorate will be able to hold some of those politicians to account. Again, the main challenge that we experience here is the prevalence of misinformation and disinformation. We have numerous instances where we have not only parody accounts being made of politicians or information being shared with the intent to be able to mislead the electorate. And looking at, again, back to the question around where people and the electorate here in Kenya draw political information and draw their news, 82% of survey respondents said that they used social media as a source of news. But at the same time, 75% of respondents actually found it difficult to differentiate between fake and real news on the internet. So even in as far as a significant number of respondents use social media to draw their news, still 75% of them are really not able to differentiate between real and fake news, and so that's a challenge. I had one slide which I would have presented, but I'll just tell you a little bit about what it's about. It's with regard to trust in terms of social media for news. The point I was just making And one of the reasons that this particular infographic was of interest to me is that of a number of countries, Kenya is at the very, very top of the list, with about 46% of people expressing trust. This is from July 2021, expressing trust in social media for news. What was also of interest, apart from Kenya being at the top of that list, is when you look at the average and then look at those countries that had the most trust in social media for news. Many of those come from the developing world, as it were. And when you look at the bottom end of the spectrum in terms of those countries that had the least trust in social media for news, those tend to be in the developed world. So the question is whether this is as a result of literacy levels in various countries in the developed versus the developing world. But I think that's probably a discussion for another day. So I've mentioned the fact that what I was looking at was whether politicians on digital platforms had become a resource or a threat, given the threat that is posed by misinformation and disinformation. As a result of the digital revolution that has placed social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp at the very center of the political discourse. So politics and both politics and politicians have actually been forced to attempt to keep pace with these very rapid technological developments. What I was able to sort of glean from all the respondents that I was able to speak to in the survey that I did for this paper, it's clear that politicians have prioritized their social media presence. I don't think it is as a result of appreciation necessarily in social media itself, but rather they have prioritized their social media presence simply because of the fact that it is necessitated by the sheer number of the electorate who are using social media, and so they have to use it to communicate their priorities, their activities, events, and achievements, as well as their positions on national issues. Now, of course, it goes a little further than that. Politicians also use social media to discuss the politics of the day. And this will necessarily include, particularly when you are in coming very, very close to an electoral event. This will include the sharing of propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation as well. So I think one of the questions that arises then is that with all these communications, do politicians also use social media to capture feedback from their constituents rather than just as a one-way communication method? So this sort of brought into my view what I've called the push versus pull dynamics. I've talked about the one-way communication where politicians are using social media to be able to communicate their own priorities, their own agenda, all their ideological leaning. So they're using it to push messaging and policies. Social media by design, though, is very well suited to an exchange of ideas. It's suited to a conversation or even a discussion between two or more actors. but the majority of politicians haven't really capitalized on that opportunity. And one of the, I think one of the very popular publications that's come out in recent years on this issue the title of it is a very clear illustration of that. That's the Nanjala Nyabola book entitled Digital Democracy, Analog Politics. So the point there is that democracy has gone digital, but that politics has failed to keep up and is still operating in a very analog fashion. So as a result of the survey and the various discussions I had, there is very little evidence of politicians using social media to pull feedback, to be able to draw ideas and even just day-to-day engagement from constituents. It was clear that many people who do choose to engage with politicians on social media sometimes end up a little bit frustrated in that their engagement may result in zero response, or it may result in in a response that maybe isn't satisfactory. So in as much as that there is this opportunity for to be able to pull ideas and engagement, that still hasn't been utilized satisfactorily and results in many members of the electorate feeling a little bit frustrated. So this is a wasted opportunity, as making use of social media for that engagement could greatly influence policy making, legislation and legislative efforts. So very quickly, before I conclude, I just want to talk about some of the key findings, from the research. The first is on the issue of accessibility. Most politicians, as I mentioned before, have prioritized their social media presence. That's partly because of the fact that a failure to maintain a social media presence can lead to multiple parody accounts or even mischief, people making fake accounts and then simply being able to share completely erroneous or fake information about a particular politician. The other reality which we have to face is that social media managers are very often in charge of the accounts of politicians. So just the mere fact of a politician being on social media doesn't necessarily mean that there is always direct access to the office holder. In many instances, those accounts are being run by social media managers. So what are the results then of this increased accessibility? There is definitely more widespread policy debates. Here in Kenya, we've had examples in recent years of laws being amended as a result of social media discussions. We've seen laws being set aside. We've seen priorities being amended by the ruling party or by various elements within Parliament. So the more widespread policy debate is welcome. But it was the feeling of the majority of respondents that we still cannot understate the value of personal and physical engagement with regards to politics. And this is especially the case here on the African continent. So there may be cultural undertones to that, in that our culture is very much geared towards personal engagement. So the feeling of the majority of respondents was that social media can only really complement what politicians do, in terms of their own physical and personal engagements. And it is of assistance here in Kenya, even constitutionally, because of the fact that there is a constitutional requirement for public participation, and there have been numerous instances where pieces of legislation fail to meet the constitutional requirements for public participation and are therefore set aside. So it is possible to be able to use social media to be able to improve on the constitutional requirement for public participation. Another key finding with regards to misinformation and disinformation, the reality is that propaganda was part and parcel of politics long before the internet and social media ever came along. So I think that's just a reality that we have to be alive to. But due to the growth and popularity of the space and of social media has become a key battleground, both ideologically as well as politically. So in terms of the onus for the onus for exercising a duty of care in terms of what is shared on social media platforms, obviously much of this must go to the ownership of social media platforms, though with regard to that, content moderation has proven to be a major challenge. And civic education, I think, can also be used to be able to manage the threat of misinformation so that the electorate are better able to understand not just the threat posed by misinformation, but also to be able to better discern what is real and what is fake in terms of news and political information and data that they're sourcing from the internet. So the findings are a little bit of a mixed bag. Yes, we do have greater accessibility. Yes, we do see politicians pushing their message, pushing their priorities, but very little pulling of engagement with the electorate using social media. So there are some positive results in terms of increased accessibility, but certainly the prevalence of misinformation and disinformation still remains a challenge. Part of that challenge is the issue of content moderation. Most of the major social media platforms are under tremendous public and political pressure to do more to address misinformation and disinformation. And the challenge that they face in this regard is that the sheer volume of content that they have to deal with. For example, if even just looking at Kenya, there are 65 languages spoken in Kenya alone. So being able to mobilize content moderation for 65 languages in just one country is a tremendous challenge and a humongous ask. So that's part of the challenge that some of the major social media platforms are facing with regard to content moderation. So as a result, this kind of raises a couple of different questions for me, and this is where I'll close. Those questions, the first of which is that yes, we have seen the potential really that social media has for informing public policy debates. But the question arises as a result of this research, is social media the correct forum for public policy debates? The reason I ask this is that, given the private ownership of social media, given the business model of social media and social objectives, one of the questions that certainly I'm now thinking about is whether social media is the correct forum for public policy debates. And is it perhaps time for more homegrown or even purpose-built solutions with regards to politics and public policy, despite tremendous reach and functionality of social media? Are we perhaps expecting a little bit too much in terms of social media lending itself to the public policy discourse, if you consider that perhaps this may not be what social media was ultimately designed for? And finally,
okay.
yeah.
Now, let me finish your last point, because I do want to leave some time for the question and answers as well.
It is exactly one last point, so I will be done in less than a minute. Thank you for the time warning. And the last question that sort of I'm posing to myself and to others is if there are other models that would be more appropriate. Is the WeChat model one of those models? And that model from China, WeChat being sort of this all-encompassing platform that combines social media, instant messaging, payment facilities, among other things. But the interesting thing around the WeChat model is that it also has the ability to add on mini programs or additional apps for specific purposes, such as, for example, political communications, public policy, and that type of thing. So these are just some things to think about, and I will end there so that we can have a discussion.
No, thanks so much. It was a fascinating discussion. I'm sure there's quite a few questions, because I have some of my own. If you are online, you can just raise your hand if you have any questions, but I'll look within the room first if there's anyone wants to start.
Halfdan is sitting.
Yeah, Halfdan is eating. So let's Halfdan go first, and we can keep our questions brief.
Thanks for that, Coach. And hi, Tom. Thanks for your presentation. I've had the privilege, I think, of reading all of the different drafts of your paper. So I will allow myself to perhaps go a little bit beyond the paper. So in your paper, your perspective is very sort of systemic, or you're focusing on politicians and how they behave, or the platforms and different types of social media. And I was just curious on your thoughts on the question of, for citizens, for the electorate, this kind of online political participation is, from your perspective, is it just offline participation that is moved online? Or do you see the kind of participation as online participation? Is it inherently different? And there's a big sort of, globally, there's a discussion around whether online and offline political participation is just an extension, that one is an extension of the other, or is it inherently different? But that debate is very much focused on sort of Europe, North America. And I was just curious, from your perspective, do you see them as different? Is it a different demographic that engages, and do they engage in a different way? Or is it just another sort of vehicle or means of communication? Does it make sense? And I apologize for already.
So I think we'll try and take a round of questions as well. And hopefully you can squeeze in 2 rounds. Geshe.
Thanks for the presentation. It was quite interesting. I can ask out of ignorance since it's not my field. The 2 questions, the one is, you've talked about the extent of social media use in the different countries, but I wonder if there's any information about the demographic profile of that. And I guess what I'm wondering is it an African elite that's on social media, or do we have evidence that it's more than that? So it could be 40%, but 40% of whom? And that could be about, obviously, class, gender, rural, urban. So just curious if there's any sense of that. The second question I have is really to query this issue of, and it's a whole big topic, then you can just discard the question, but the threat of mis and disinformation. And you called it sometimes a threat, and sometimes you called it prevalence, meaning it's already existing. Do we know whether that's any worse on social media than it already was? Before it became more diffused through social media. Oops, and there we get cut off. I'll give you the last part of the question. You can ask it then. Oh, they're back. Sorry, Tom, can you hear us now?
Yes, you sort of cut out there at the tail end, but I think I got the gist of.
Yeah, this is a question about to what extent is that, I mean, do we have any evidence or is this just like fear of something? Because when you talk then about quantum moderation, I'm quite curious about what that even means, not the quantum part, but the moderation bit. What is the nature of moderation we're talking about? Because it seems, I think there's a risk of believing that there are truer actors than others. And I'm worried about that.
And then,
Okay.
if there's anyone else online, I have one quick question, and it's about the threat element. So in the last national elections in South Africa, the IEC came out and said there was an active social media campaign, primarily led by the Russian government to influence the elections using social media. And that report then died a slow death. And the question then becomes, what aspects of democracy help counteract this threat when the politicians are incentivized not to stop it, if that makes sense? Within the South African context, all the major parties have bot farms, all the major parties have this active use of social media, both with misinformation and disinformation. No one has clean hands, essentially. So the question then becomes, what's the external democratic institution that you think should be created in this new age, at least from your own thinking, that would help defend a democracy against this threat?
Okay. Should we start with that lot?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So let me start with Halfdan's question, and hopefully I understood it correctly. Is whether from my perception there is a difference between offline participation and online participation, and whether one is just being moved from either the offline to the online. And in my perception, there is a difference. Because first of all, if you look at online participation, I spoke earlier on about how people engaging online may act in a way that is at variance with how they would ordinarily engage or act. So if you can imagine a situation where those of you sitting in the room having a discussion on a particular issue, moving that discussion, very same discussion, to an online forum would possibly and probably result in a very different conversation taking place, based on the fact that when people are online and engaging on social media, they do so differently. Let's not forget that especially when it comes to politics, people engage online and on social media possibly in a way to suit a particular agenda. For example, they may be engaging in support of a particular candidate or a particular politician, and so their engagement online is very specific. It is geared and it is deliberate. So for me, I find that has really a tremendous difference to how somebody might behave in terms of their offline democratic participation or political participation. In the offline context, you have the benefit of seeing face to face and engaging with those who you are engaging with, whereas the challenge, as we all know, and as I've often mentioned, with online political participation, is that many people will choose to do so anonymously, and some will choose to do so anonymously for mischievous reasons. So for me, that's why I find that I think there is definitely a difference. Though I know that certainly in various engagements that I've had as well, quite often the discussion that people who participate in online engagements have is, how do they make their online engagements translate to offline results, especially with regards to democratic participation. I hope I've at least in some part answered that question. The second one had to do with demographic profile. The very broad answer to that is that there is, looking at the global digital overview reports, there is demographic data available in terms of who is it, if we look at the African context, is it an African elite that is engaging on social media? For me, I would say that partly it is, and the reason that I say that is I just remember looking at some of the data, looking at Facebook data versus Twitter data, for example. Facebook has much greater reach than Twitter. I don't know if this is the same in South Africa as it is in Kenya, but certainly in Kenya you find that Twitter engagement is much more elite driven. It is considered the platform of choice for urban elites. Again, I don't know whether that's the case, a similar case in South Africa. And as a result, you find that even in terms of Kenyan social media engagement, they have actually formed a pretty robust presence on Twitter, and you may have come across Kenyans on Twitter, and woe unto you if you upset them in any way, because they are notorious for being pretty ruthless in their engagements. So there's plenty of demographic information available, and you mentioned the issue around threat, and when I used the term threat, really what I was referring to is not a threat of something that may or may not happen in the future, but rather the threat that it poses, the real and present danger, as it were. So that's the context in which I was using that term. And with regard to the question on content, I'm trying to remember the question on content moderation. I think the issue around content moderation is going beyond just the issue of harm in terms of harmful content, but also being able to sieve or to weed out misinformation and disinformation, which is almost impossible to do. And again, I use the Kenyan example where there are 65 odd languages spoken in Kenya. So if I'm a Facebook or a Twitter, how am I supposed to be able to moderate what's going on my platform in 65 odd different languages? And this creates a tremendous challenge. So there are various, and there's a lot of literature actually in terms of how and why social media platforms engage in various different models of content moderation. But I think that the point that I was trying to make was simply around the challenge that is created by the volume of content there is out there. And lastly, what aspects of democracy might help to counteract some of these the various bot farms that we've come across that have been prevalent, I think, not only in the South African election, as you mentioned, but we've had similar instances here in Kenya. as well as various other parts of the continent, there is a part of me that feels that just as the misinformation and disinformation are not, as I said before, are not new to politics. They're not as a result of they didn't come about as a result of the internet and as a result of social media. These have been part and parcel of politics all along. And so, the challenge that we are facing is now how to manage them, given the face of the reality of political participation and democratic participation on social media. And so I think first and foremost, civic education goes a very long way. I think we have to realize that in all of our African countries, more and more people are getting access to the internet, access to social media with every passing day and every passing year. And so it's actually of critical importance that people are able to understand that not everything that appears on the internet or on social media is gospel truth, but also that people are able to be sensitized in terms of, well, if that's the case, how do we differentiate between what is real and what is fake news, for lack of a better word. And I think even just from my own perspective and interactions, I haven't seen a tremendous amount in terms of efforts in that regard.
Perfect. Now, I might abuse time here, but there's two questions, but we also need to do the updates. So we've got one question in the chat, and then we'll take one in the room. And the question in the chat, essentially, I'll summarize it as best as I can, relates to this idea that you have this demographic difference. There's a lot of young people on the continent. A lot of them are increasingly becoming tech savvy, and out of that is the consequence of what the question describes as internet activism. And I like the way the question is phrased, because it asks, does internet activism essentially provide new ways or new strengths for new forms of political engagement? And whether, especially because there's so many young people on the continent, that's increasingly growing. So does internet activism offer new opportunities for political engagement? And we have one question in the room as well, and then we'll definitely be way over time at that point. So, Dr. Matobi, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, Tom.
Hi.
It's just a suggestion to actually structure or contextualize the research from the perspective of the different players that we're looking at. In one area, you have a politician, and then you'd have an electorate, and so the idea is to look at the incentives of both the players, in terms of one wants to push their agenda through this platform, and then the other one wants to understand what the politicians is offering via that same platform. But I think from that particular perspective, then we could be asking the question of, if this platform is around, how has it changed the status quo? And and I'm talking about this in the sense that if I look at the literature, or even the the realities, that most of people who are online are the youth who don't necessarily participate in elections, and the interest for communication for politicians would be to actually communicate in a way that they sway electorates to them. So in that particular case, would a politician be interested in communicating via WhatsApp these things, or would they prefer to go to people who are offline, who are their voters? I don't know if my question makes sense. I'm so worried about time because I have a lot to say here, but I'm worried about time. Yes.
Person for person chat here, Tom.
Fair enough. Okay, so very quickly, yes, internet. Young people are increasingly tech savvy, and so as a result of that, we have internet activism and new forms of political engagement. I'm not sure if there was a specific question there, but certainly, as a result of internet activism, as a result of even social media activism, we do find new forms of political engagement taking place. Some of these are restricted to those online platforms and digital platforms. Some of those are very deliberately with an intention or a hope of being able to then translate to offline participation and offline action. And so, but I think it depends from one case to the next whether that's actually taking place. I very much take on board your point with regards to contextualizing the research. That's something that I've been thinking about as well. Yes, we've got you have the politician on one perspective, the electorate looking at it from their perspective, the politician pushing his message, but probably in terms of the political class simply just not doing enough yet in terms of using the internet and social media to be able to pull engagement from the electorate themselves. And so for me, this is, it's a huge wasted opportunity. And, maybe even in some ways, a lack of appreciation of what can be accomplished using these various online digital platforms. You also mentioned the fact that, how have these platforms changed the status quo, and drawing from the Kenyan context, I think it's changed the status quo in terms of the level of political and public policy debate. As somebody who's been sort of in the game, as it were, for a number of years now, one of the differences that I have seen is that before the internet and social media were as prevalent as they are now, many of these kinds of discussions were either elite-based, elite-focused, or taking place within civil society, but then, falling woefully short of being able to include, sort of the wider community and the wider electorate. So social media has certainly offered an opportunity for that. And lastly, the point that you made with regards to the fact that youth not participating in elections, this is something I wrote something about just very recently, and it's actually quite alarming for me, the fact that despite young people being tech savvy, despite the fact that young people now, as a result of digital platforms, as a result of the internet, have a tremendous amount more access to data, to information, to political engagement, still, for whatever reason, and this is not just in Kenya, it's not just in South Africa, it's happening all over the continent. If you look at voter registrations statistics, for example, as well as voter turnout statistics, you find that young people, first of all, the young people certainly are losing interest in elections for whatever reason. But also it seems that even just in general, that voter turnout, for example, is on the decline. I don't know. I don't have the answer as to why, but I think it's an alarming statistic.
Perfect. Thanks so much. And again, we really appreciate your time that you've taken. And we are currently reviewing your comments as well, so you'll hear all the feedback on your paper fairly soon.
Wonderful.
For those who don't know, Mr. Mboya's paper forms part of a working paper series that Tayarisha is working on developing in conjunction with the Hans Seidel Foundation. So please be on the lookout for that. And I'm going to hand over to our amazing leader to give us a quick update. To give us a quick update on Tayarisha, and then we'll close.
The reigning politician here. Okay, no, thank you. And I'll try to be very brief. So thank you, first of all, Tom, for your paper and your presentation. We really appreciate this. The series has been an important way for us to just engage with each other and get to munch on some of these ideas, also beyond some of our own disciplines. So it's always quite inspiring to sort of hear what others are thinking about. Thanks for those who are online as well. I'll be very brief because I think we don't have too much time. I think perhaps we try to give these updates just so that people also know what's happening within the center and can keep abreast of things. We just completed running last week our first Civic Tech short course. That was a live course we held here at the School of Governance on Civic Tech Innovation. And so that was a pilot that we partnered with the Human Sciences Research Council for. And I think it was very successful. We are hoping or fearing that there may be demand that we do more of that going forward. And so we may be worth mentioning that it ended up having a lot more demand from the public sector than we had anticipated. We'd expected it would appeal to the civil sector, but we'll try and see how we work on that in future to get a bit more of a balance. I think I'd mentioned previously that we launched a civic tech evidence map as well last month. So I think that's also an interesting little resource for those who might be interested. I think we did put it on social media for Tayarisha as well. So people can pick that up and just have a look if you're interested, either in the content in terms of what civic tech has been, what research has been, what bodies of research there are around civic tech, but also if you're interested in the tool, and that's partly what we were also experimenting with, is whether this evidence mapping approach as a methodology is useful for the sorts of research that we take interest in. I think outside of that, maybe to mention that we'll continue with the Lunchbox series. We've actually had a few more seminars recently than usual. We had one last week with Dr. Luke, what's Luke's last name?
Lucas Sabini.
Lucas, is it?
Sabini.
And we have one coming up in another 2 weeks, I think, with Dr.
Magdalene.
Dr. Magdalene. Madeline, okay. And I think the posters for that are on our website and on our social media. So please feel free. Those are some of those are seminars that have been linked to a global program that Dr. Motobi here is part of, the Global Crucible program with the University of Leeds. And we've been having rather interesting inputs from those as well. But we will also continue with our Tayarisha lunch boxes, and there will certainly be a session next month. I'm sure Zibusiso will be sharing more about that in due course. There's been an open call for postdocs on our website. That's still open, although we've began having some interviews and engagements. So I think look out for that for those of you who have good people out there that might be interested in linking to Tayarisha. And other than that, there's a lot going on. Work continues. Rosafete has mentioned the working paper series that we're busy trying to wrap up from last year, and we're hoping to be able to maybe launch another round of that soon. So yeah, please keep engaging. If you're not on our mailing list and would like to receive notifications, please contact Zibusiso. And I think I can stop there and wish everybody happy Easter, happy Passover, happy full moon, happy everything.
Yeah, once again, thanks so much to everyone. And we'll see you at the next event next week. 2 weeks from now. 2 weeks from now. That has been advertised tremendously over the last 2 weeks or last week or so. So please join us for that and on our next lunchbox. Thank you so much, and we'll see you all soon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.